All right. Whew. Okay. So today, kind of on the agenda is to get through kind of the last stuff we have on our different generational cohorts. So I think we finished up the last slide on Gen Z, but I'll just touch on it again really quickly because I think I kind of rushed through it on Friday. Talk about some Gen Alpha stuff, some very preliminary Gen Alpha data, and then move into talking about education. And we'll kind of see where we're going. All right. This is the question from last time. For the exams, are you writing them at home? You can write them anywhere you want, right? You can write them on campus, but yes, they're basically asynchronous, right? So on the day of the exam, we don't have class. It's open from midnight to midnight, right? So midnight to 11:59 p.m. Once you pop it open, you get 90 minutes to do your 5 short answer questions. But yeah, you don't do it in this environment, right? Because it's open book, but open book with these kinds of setups with, I think we're 135 people registered in the class. It's a little much, right? There's not anywhere really good to set yourself up. And, if you have paper notes, it's a bit of a schmozzle. Not that anyone uses paper notes anymore, but I still imagine that someone might. Or if you have 2 devices, right? Your iPad with your notes and your laptop for typing. So I just have you do it at home, right? And yeah, or anywhere you like. You can do it honestly anywhere. So yeah, that's the answer to that question. Okay. Good times. Okay, so we're talking about this last time, right? So we ended off kind of talking about Gen Z particularly and their kind of form of what you might say is pessimism, right? A bit of a cultural pessimism, if you will. Or I really want the magnifying glass to come back. But I can't get it to come back and say, oh no, now I've broken it. Laser pointer only. Okay. They're pessimism, right? And they're the kind of sense that Gen Z, when it comes to their feelings about society, that they have a somewhat different view of society, and one that is much less positive and optimistic, especially than the millennials did at the same point in their lives, right? So we pointed to a few of these things, and that is not going to let me zoom. Hang on, back and forth. Hey, where are you, magnifying glass? I don't know why it does this to me. I will, honestly, I made this work before class, and it was working perfectly, and now not at all. Okay. Hopefully you can see these well enough, these little charts. Okay, so what do we have, right? So we talked about it. 6 in 10 Gen Zers don't think America is a fair society where everyone can get ahead, right? So here, that's what we have, right? And you see the difference, right, in our generational cohorts. And this is, where did this data come from? Voter survey, Democracy Fund, right? So you see the silence, and every generation before, Gen Z seems to feel America is much more fair. And that sentiment kind of gains steam with each generational cohort, right? So Gen Z is just the kind of furthest along. But Gen X and Millennials certainly were less positive, or are less positive, about American society than the Boomers and the silence. Significant changes needed, right? That's the burn it all down. That's like over 70% of our Gen Zers. And then, the founders as villains, right? They're out. You can see how different Gen Z is in terms of these attitudes, right? They're way out of step with other generations, closest to the Millennials, pretty naturally, but still way out of step with other ones. All right, hard to have hope for the world, and you can kind of see, and this is by birth year, right? Or, sorry, share of 12th graders agreeing with this statement. This is monitoring the future, right? So this is, each year they do the survey, and, hard to find hope for the future. That kind of starts around 2002 is like the trough, and then from there it's risen. And Gen Z pretty negative about the future, not very hopeful. The least hopeful so far, right, though, if we go back to our Gen Xers around here, they were pretty cynical too. I wonder if purpose to life, given the world situation, and again, right? That's been rising really since kind of the millennials, that first wave of the millennials, that has been rising, and it's way above even kind of averages for what was going on, say, in 1972 with some of our boomers in there. And then, right, expectations for what's going to happen. Generally, our Gen Zers are, don't have as much hope, don't think that as good of things are going to happen for them, right? They expect, fewer of them are expecting a professional job. Then again, say, our late Gen X, early millennial kind of cohort. Yeah, sorry, is that a question or you're just?
I don't, there's only one, but in the Slido, someone asked if the stream was working. Did you turn it on?
I did turn it on.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure it was on for this person, so that probably them.
It looks okay.
Okay.
Yay. All right, thank you for checking. I don't know, as far as I can tell, it's working. If it's not, I don't know what to tell you.
It's only one person.
Only one, that one person. I even put it up early today because I was early to class. There we go. So it should be showing up. I don't know. Where was I? But thank you for asking. Oh, now I've lost my slideshow. No, it's good. It's working for you. Okay. All good. No, perfect. All right. What was I saying here? Yes. Do they expect a professional job, right? Now, that has kind of slacked off a little bit, with this wave of data. And this, again, is monitoring the future. So this is a big longitudinal survey that's been going on since the 70s, right? We're kind of back down to where we were with Gen Z right around the 1980s, right? So that kind of first wave of Gen Xers coming in. So again, Gen Z, Gen X, in terms of pessimism, they're kind of on the downslope for this, is interesting as well. And then this bottom line, right, expect to own more than their parents. And you see, right, this is going back, this is kind of declining pretty severely. And it had been in a long-term kind of upward trend since the beginning of monitoring the future, right? So they are way more pessimistic about the future than other cohorts. All right, so let's leave Gen Z behind and talk about, this is pretty fresh data. So this data comes out of a survey done in 2024 of about 1,200, I believe. That's going to say on one of the other slides, I'm sure. Gen Alpha youth, right? So 13-year-olds in this case, because this was basically the first year that they were sort of coming into this data set. It's done by Springtide Research Institute, so they're a US-based kind of private research institute that does really, really interesting work, especially around youth. So you're going to see them lots of times through the course because I really like their data. So I grab it where I can because I think they do really interesting stuff, and they've got a pretty good set of resources to survey 13 to 18-year-olds, which is somewhat rare in a lot of our data sets. So we're going to talk about Gen Alpha. All right, so we got Gen Alpha, 2011 to, I'm not sure when the end date for Gen Alpha is going to be. I mean, probably somewhere in the 10 to 15 year range, right? So we're probably at this point, 2025, 2026 is probably the end point of this particular generational cohort. But that's now the youngest part is their babies, right? So we know next to nothing about them. The first kind of wave of our Gen Alphas, right, started to come into their adolescent years in 2024, right? So they would have been 13 in 2024. So, at this point, they're going to be just like some of them turning 15. So they're still very, very young. So a lot, like any of the data here, is very provisional in the sense that, yeah, it's, they're still taking their form as a generation and as young people. So interesting kind of first snapshot, and I think this data tells some interesting stories. Okay. So yeah, the oldest members of Gen Alpha came into their teens, right? So they turned 13 in 2024. And Springtide sort of broke down their findings into, was it 12 points? 13 points, I was close. So, some key points. they're like principally, how do they identify themselves? What identity markers are really important? Age is the most important one. Turning 13, right, becoming teenagers, a huge milestone for this generational cohort. As you would expect in adolescence, friendships are paramount. And because each generational cohort seems to be more and more racially diverse, their friendships are broadly pretty diverse, right? Smartphones, right? Everybody wants to talk about smartphones, and we will ad nauseum through the course. Smartphones feel addictive, and their parents monitor their use, right? And this is a little bit different than, say, it was for a lot of Gen Z youth. Parents, largely millennials, for this cohort, are much more involved in their online lives and monitor it much more closely. Excuse me. Okay. Yeah, so nearly all 13-year-olds say they have a smartphone, and I showed you that last time, but we'll see it again in a sec, and half agree that they are addicted to it, right? So again, addiction here is an interesting kind of language to use. We'll talk about that. I don't love the addiction language all the time when it comes to smartphones, but that's colloquially how it's talked about. More than half of 13-year-olds say they have to ask their parents' permission to use apps or sites. And I mean, this is despite the fact that, say, technically speaking, by US and Canadian law, 13 is the age of digital adulthood, where you are technically allowed to sign up for a lot of social media sites and such. There's a lot of controversy and a lot of questions, say, around Australia's recent legislation, putting that age at 16 years old, which we can talk about. But yeah, still parents are pretty involved. And there are more and more tools that are responsive to this, as it becomes, a cultural concern. Companies like Google and Apple and Microsoft and many others are providing more and more tools for monitoring these devices so that kids still get them. Otherwise, parents might opt out of them altogether. And yeah, they also report that parents limit their screen time. COVID, they're on the younger end of the people who kind of will probably remember a lot of the impacts of COVID, right? So about 3/4 of them said COVID had positive, mixed, or neutral overall impact on their lives. Particularly economic and racial inequalities means that it was experienced differentially in different quarters of society, with poor and racialized minorities more likely to report negative effects. Okay, racial and ethnic identities frame outlooks. We'll talk about that a little bit, but race matters, especially to those who are they categorize them as BIPOC in this report. This one, which might surprise people. Religion and spirituality are a common part of identity in life. I'll show you some of this, right? A lot of them are still slightly spiritual or slightly religious or both, which again, sometimes surprises people. And teens who believe in a higher power and who see religion as personally important are less likely to report feeling unhappy and lonely. Now, this is a super robust social science finding that if you know anything about the literature, you should not be surprised. Religious people regularly, and we have decades and decades of data that go in this direction, report being happier and more fulfilled than their non-religious counterparts. Okay. They're not all that political, not surprising. At 13, they don't know much about politics, and they're not super political. They're worried about things like climate change and other disasters. They like AI. We can look at that a little bit too. They see racial diversity as a good thing, and loneliness, worry, and anxiety happen. We'll talk a lot about loneliness, worry, and anxiety again a little bit later in the course. But yeah, it's definitely on their radar. They're really familiar with the language of these things. But for them, it doesn't seem, at least at this point, that it's overwhelming. Okay, and yeah, despite, what we said about Gen Z, being very risk averse, Gen Alpha looks a little bit more risk tolerant than Gen Z did, potentially at the same age, right? Which is interesting as well. Okay, so just kind of breaking down identity, right? And I'll try to go through this relatively quickly. what's most important, right? And you see in terms of their most important identity marker, age is the most important one, followed by gender, and then family, and everything else is kind of, pretty small in terms of its. They just pushed the button and walked by. I saw them walk by. If I had more time, I'd chase them down. You're like, old man yells at student. Okay. So, all right. We see, right, basically, it's age that's their most important kind of feature at the moment, right? The fact that they are just rounding into adolescence. Okay. This is the riskiness, right? They'll do, 2/3 of them say they'll do something that makes them feel nervous or scared if it's for a good opportunity, right? So not terribly risk averse. And 1/3 say they would rather miss out on a good opportunity than feel nervous or scared. And again, I think this contrasts to a lot of what Twenge in particular said about Gen Z. They're a very safety conscious generation, maybe Gen Alpha a little bit less. Provisional kind of finding, I'll say, as this is like the first cohort coming through into our data. Okay. Yeah, well, race and ethnicity both feel important. When they talk about their identity, most of them say they are just American, right? If you're white, 80% of white Americans say just American as an identity, versus 41% of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So definitely white people a little bit less race conscious. And certainly, I think this is probably good news that, the white majority in the US largely just thinks of themselves as American and haven't adopted a really strong racial identity, right? They're not, I guess, in the classical sense, white supremacists. They're not like, I am white and white makes right or whatever. It's a terrible pun. I should not have made it. But that's, I would say, kind of a generally positive thing, right? Only 5% of our white population, right, thinks of themselves as part of one particular racial or ethnic group. So you see, generally speaking, just American's the most popular one, though obviously for, BIPOC individuals, race is a little bit more important. Okay, how important is your race and ethnicity when describing you? For our overall kind of sample, right, so all 13-year-olds, it's pretty mixed, right? From not, everything's about a quarter, right? From not at all the way to very important. Obviously, for those who are kind of in racialized minorities, it's more important, right? It's a more kind of part of their overall lived experience, I would say. Okay. So, friendships, right? 43%, that's right. Say the racial makeup of their school students' body is close to evenly split between white students and students of color. And this is likely to continue shifting, towards being more kind of people of color as the demographics in America continue to change, right? 1/3, it's mostly white, and then, right, a 4% only is all white. So there's lots of mixing between different racial groups, right? Most people are either in about half and half, or mostly white. Well, mostly white's not much mixing, but everything kind of other than these parts is pretty mixed. So pretty racially diverse, and only a relatively small proportion, like about 1/3, are in mostly white or all white scenarios or locales. Yeah, fewer than 1 in 20 say they attend an all-white school. The remainder are, or mostly white school, the majority reporting, majority white, sorry, the remainder are more likely to report attending a majority white school, a school where other races are in the majority, right? So this is not surprising. About 2/3 of the American population remains white. So it's about 66% at this point. So you're still going to have most people reporting that they attend schools where that is the largest proportion of the population, but they are still in more mixed cohorts than they were in the past. All right, and yeah, lots of 13-year-olds, regardless of racial identity, say they have close friends from racial groups different from their own, right? So my closest friends are, that's this chart here, and you see this, right, about evenly divided. is 46% for white students and 40% for black. White students is all different races, mostly different, 7%, right? So there's a lot of racial mixing in friendship groups. None of that is surprising given the changing demographics of the country. Okay, so yeah, across the full sample, right? So if we look at our whole sample, most 13-year-olds feel that their racial or ethnic identity doesn't really affect their opportunities in life. This is most strongly felt by white students, right? Where 84% said no. But still, a solid virtually 2/3 majority of Black, Indigenous, and people of color answering, have you ever felt discriminated against because of your race or ethnicity? That's still 2/3 that say no. And about, a third, a little bit over a third that say yes, and 16% of white students that say that as well. Right. And if we look, my race and ethnicity makes my opportunities in life, we got better, right? A third of white and 14% of BIPOC individuals say that. Worse, very few white people think that. So that's, again, interesting. 22% of, BIPOC. It has no effect, right? So for white people, it's about half, about 40% for racialized groups, and then not sure, right? A pretty solid group there. 25% for our BIPOC, and sorry, I lost my number. What is it? 16% for white students. So mostly they seem to think it's either, neutral, has no effect. Pretty robust there. Okay. And most of them seem to think, over half, that, racial and ethnic diversity is either a very good thing, almost 30%, another slightly more than quarter say a good thing, and then, another quarter say neither a good or bad thing. So mostly they seem to think that racial diversity is either good or neutral, right? So relatively, not surprising given how tolerant Gen Z was and millennials before them, that Gen Alpha would follow that same sort of pattern. Okay, this is my sort of wheelhouse, and the stuff that really interests me is the religion and spirituality stuff. See, my other class is I teach a whole class on sociology of youth and religion. So, that's me. Interestingly though, right, when we talk about kind of Gen Alpha, relatively big numbers, right? So nearly 50%, 49% say they are either very or moderately spiritual. And, if you add slightly spiritual, you add another third, right? So the vast majority consider themselves at least somewhat spiritual, which, again, if you're putting on your sociology of religion hat, interesting kind of numbers. If you're thinking, is this a very secular society? Might not think so. Religious person, obviously there are fewer that consider themselves a religious person, but it's still a solid, slightly less than 3/4 that are between very and slightly religious, right? With only a quarter saying that they're not religious at all, right? And again, given our sort of narrative that, each generational cohort is less and less spiritual and religious, these are sort of interesting findings, though again, provisional, and generally this will fade a little bit as people get older. Definitely kind of an interesting thing. And yeah, only 13% do not identify as either religious or spiritual. 82% say they're at least slightly spiritual. So, right, really, really interesting. Definitely not what you might expect given the kind of narratives around religion that we tend to see. Okay, and yeah, 74% identify as at least slightly religious. So, again, interesting numbers. All right, if we look at the breakdown, and again, America is a little different. Canada would be closer, like in terms of Christian, would be closer to 50% probably. 2/3 of 13-year-olds in the US still identify as Christian, about the same proportion as American society overall. Of those, 50% identify as just Christian, which is an interesting, and we'll talk about that more when we talk about religion and spirituality, but it's a really interesting number because that tells us something about their institutional context and, you know, whether they're institutionally bound or bound to more traditional kind of religious identities, which they're clearly not. Next biggest one for those who identify as Christian is Roman Catholic, and then Protestant. Big shift in American society is the decline in this number is interesting because it used to be the vast majority who would have said they're Protestant, but that's changed in the last couple of generational cohorts. Okay, so, all right, now the stuff that's maybe a little bit more interesting to you. Smartphones, right, nearly universal. I pointed this out last time, right? 97% of our 13-year-olds have a smartphone. 90% have access to a smartphone. 90% have access to a computer or laptop, right, or desktop or laptop. 90% have access to a gaming console, right? So those things are all fairly ubiquitous, right? Smartphones, desktops and laptops, gaming consoles are really ubiquitous, right? 9 out of 10 of them say that they have, or more, say that they have access to them. Tablet computers, right? So your iPads, largely, 82%, so slightly less, right? And this is not surprising, right? Tablets were really popular for a while, and then, you know, as phones got bigger, a lot of people just started using their phone for a lot of things they would have used an iPad for. So that's there. And then, and I have to say, thank God for this one, only about 42% have access to a virtual reality headset. I say this because I was just listening to, I was reading a Substack, right? And it was talking about some of the legal problems at Meta and how, you know, the metaverse thing where you would wear the Facebook virtual reality headset, it was like infested with pedophiles. So, you know, I'm like, whew, dodged a bullet there, except if you're in that 42%. You know, so that one was one of the more popular ones because it was one of the cheaper ones. But yeah, virtual reality headsets remain kind of a lagging one in terms of technology. Okay. In general, I am on my phone, right? So how much do they spend time on their phone? You know, so almost a fifth say they spend more than 6 hours a day, which is a lot. 5 to 6 hours a day is another quarter of them, roughly, a little bit less. You know, 40%, it's 3 to 4 hours a day. You know, 0 hours a day is only 2%. So again, minority position in terms of young people spending no time on phones. And yeah, 1 to 2 hours a day is, you know, less than a fifth. So most kids are spending, you know, a huge chunk of time, 3 hours or more, right, a day on smartphones. So it is, you know, largely one of their principal occupations. Okay, now of course they're doing it while they do other things too. And, you know, young people are likely to say they multitask and they're watching TV while on their phone and other things, right? Nevertheless, they're engaged with smartphones a lot and for big chunks of the day. Okay, how would they respond to I'm addicted to my phone, right? So nearly, not quite, 2/5, not quite half, a little bit more than 2/5 say they are addicted. They would say they are addicted. A little bit over a third disagree, with the remaining share being like, I don't know, I guess, you know, neither agree nor disagree. So a lot of them use their phones a lot. A good number of them likely see this as a problematic pattern of use, but, you know, it's difficult for them to break out of it, right? They are so ubiquitous in society today. Okay. So, okay, I mean, I could tell you, we banned social media entirely for our kids until they turned 16. My daughter just turned 16, and she hasn't asked yet if she can have social media. I think the only one she really wants is Pinterest, and I don't know how I feel about that. Pinterest is, you know, it sounds like it's like just crafts, but actually, like, there's TikTok videos on it too, so I'm a little weirded out by it. I looked at what Pinterest was and I'm like, this is not what I assumed you were. I feel duped. So yeah, she can ask now, and you know, she hasn't yet. But that was our like minimum age for social media. At 13, they get a really useless smartphone, like an old one. So my son is currently rocking, I think like an iPhone 8, like an old one that we had lying around the house, so he can communicate with his friends on iMessage, but it doesn't have data. Just because it was like all his friends are chatting. Now he wants Discord, and I'm very leery about it. Is it social media? Kind of. Also, what is the user to pedophile ratio? I'm not 100% sure on Discord, to be perfectly honest. So, it's a really challenging one. As a 21-year-old, you just recently deleted all your social media. Like, I have Instagram on my phone, but being 43, white, and male, Instagram doesn't interest me, so I could have it on my phone all day long. I took Twitter and Facebook off my phone. I have Twitter on my iPad, so I can only use it occasionally. But yeah, I just kind of take it. I just kind of took it all off. I don't miss it either, right? But it's really challenging, right? And here, when we get to towards the end of the course, it's really difficult to say no entirely, just because, Sorry, I make that sound because this has been a frustration for us for a long time. In like the second grade, my son had friends who were rocking brand new iPhones. And I was like, that's crazy pants. But then they feel left out. And the further you go along in that timeline, the more and more left out they feel, right? So it gets really, really challenging. So we kind of like are metering it out, always with the promise that, look, if you misuse this technology goes away. It can be taken from you. But, we've probably been more permissive than some of my other friends, who are very much like, no, you get nothing. You can use the computer that's anchored to the wall in the corner, and that's all you get. Because, obviously it is central to their social lives, right? You are socially isolated without it, which, is a collective action problem. Jonathan Haidt has a lot of things to say about this particular collective action problem, and he's like, everyone should just give their kids dumb phones. And I'm like, well, that only works if everyone sort of agrees. So if you ask me, I think the Australia law is really good. I think all the evidence suggests that it's going to turn out really well in Australia. But yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. You'll be back. No, I'm kidding. Don't go back. But yeah, it's really challenging. And I'll quote the research to my kids, and they don't care. For some reason, they don't care about sociological research. So yeah. Yes, definitely. So like I said, we've been pretty restrictive. So do I think the increase in spirituality is due to influencers? Christian influencers seem to be all the rage nowadays. Dance if you love Jesus kind of thing. It's a really interesting question. And honestly, in other parts of my brain, I don't really talk about it in this class. There is there's this discourse of like a quiet revival going on, where there seems to be an increasing interest amongst young people in religion and spirituality. And I'm a little leery about it because I'm just like, this is a couple of data points and we don't know what's happening yet, so let's hold off on our judgment. But there does seem to be something going on. And yeah, it seems to be, if anything, it's driven by YouTube. YouTube seems to push religious content really, really hard for whatever reason. I don't know, maybe because Christian influencers have really targeted YouTube. Maybe TikTok. I don't know. I'm old and I don't use TikTok because I think it's dumb. Like I said, really old, and I know I'm not cool. But even like weird stuff, like as someone was showing me a bunch of TikToks, there's this one Christian song that plays pretty relentlessly in the background of TikTok videos. And I'm like, is that on purpose? I don't know if that's on purpose. Okay, cool. Wait, okay, I was done there. Right, social media. Okay. Platforms used by 13-year-olds who reported social media use once or more per day. So, and now this is a select all that applies kind of question, right? So they would select every platform that they use, and no surprise on the top two, right? YouTube and TikTok. YouTube, 82% of young people report using YouTube, who use social media once per day, reported using YouTube, right? YouTube is that number one platform. It's even more if you went to just men or boys. It's like 98%. It's crazy. TikTok, right? 2/3 using TikTok. Snapchat, about half of them. I'm actually shocked that Facebook is this high because I don't know. Maybe it's just me. Every time I go on Facebook, I'm reminded of why I stopped going on Facebook. I'm like, just nothing there. It's like the Sears of that's a very dated reference, right? Like right before Sears went out of business, there was like nothing in the store that any human would want to buy, and I feel that way about Facebook as well. Instagram and Twitter. Actually, that hardens me. Twitter is awful. I'm actually surprised by Reddit. Reddit, I thought, was much more popular than it is. So, you see, it's mostly be real. Sorry, I just found out what that was because one of my students wrote a paper about it in one of my fall classes, and apparently it's dead. So whatever. I find that funny. And Threads, the Facebook attempt to make Twitter. But yeah, I mean, you see where the dominance is. It's right basically in two platforms, super dominant, with a lot of also rans, Instagram and Facebook do okay. All right, so 99% of 13-year-olds report using social media. Not my 13-year-old, though he wants to. Most social media platforms need you to be at least 13, unless you're in Australia, where they've now made it 16. And yeah, YouTube, TikTok, and Snapchat are the most popular. And why do they use it, right? So I use social media because their friends are on it, right? So that's 2/3. To gain knowledge, right? That's a big part of why people use YouTube. Creative outlet and, all those other things. Connect to things you care about, and you use it to share knowledge, right? So all of these things are important reasons that people say they use these platforms. But the number one is because their friends are on it, right? Which makes sense. So this particular data set, reports weak overall links to mental illness. 13-year-olds who use their phones more often, they're slightly more likely to report feeling unhappy, depressed, or worried or anxious or lonely over the past month, right? Those who report more time on social media are also slightly more likely to report. It's not a really strong correlation, right? And you kind of see it in all of these, right? Your 0-hour users for all of these are only ever so slightly less likely to report feeling, loneliness, anxiety, or unhappiness as a result of this kind of technology use. Now, when we take it as a cohort, so this is based on hours used. So the hours used don't seem to have any real effect. When we look at this a little bit later in the course, we'll see in terms of cohorts, and we don't have Gen Alpha data yet. Though it's probably in the pipeline, it'll start to trickle out in the next few years. But what we saw with Gen Z is that as a cohort, they all were doing much worse than, say, millennials or Gen Xers or boomers at the same point in their lives in terms of these things. Like markers of depression and anxiety were way up. This likely has something to do with these technologies, but just how much time you spend on them doesn't seem to matter that much, right? It's only a weak kind of effect, at least in this data set. Okay, politics. I mean, not surprisingly, they're young, right? Political identity is pretty in flux with the most popular response. Political ideology, don't know. And are they Republican, Democrat, Independent, or something else? Don't know. 2/5 of them, right? And a lot of these are going to shift around, right? They're largely often connected to parental political ideology. Okay. Mormon culture has also blown up. Yeah, I mean, they're powerful tools. Is being that low is surprising. It's where the brain cells of young go to die. I thought that was TikTok. No lie. But yeah, I'm also surprised Instagram is that low. But also, all of these platforms start for young people, and then middle-aged people like me move into them, and then all the young people migrate to cooler platforms, and then we're left behind, in the Sears of social media. So, that doesn't entirely surprise me because it's been the pattern. It's Facebook at first, there were no old people on there. And then at one point my parents joined, and then no one younger than, 40 was on there anymore. So there you go. Oh, I'm done. Oh, I'm done this one. Okay. I promised I'd be done. All right. 10 minutes left. Let's go and start talking about some education. Oh, okay. So, all right, we finally finished the history stuff, and we're up to the present. Yay, huzzah. So you're the first class ever to get the Gen Alpha stuff. So, good for me for taking 2 years to get it out there. Okay, it came out last year. It wasn't actually 2 years. All right, so we're going to start talking a little bit about education. I need a sip of water here. So the reason to talk about education, we talk about, youth is pretty obvious, right? We talk about school. School is the thing that young people do, right? Bless you. I did that one time. I said bless you, and someone put in the Slido that their dog just sneezed, and how did I know? Because they were watching at home. And I always think of that when someone sneezes and I say bless you, that maybe there's some student, that sneezes 3 days from now while they're watching the video, and they're like, how did he know? Okay, so school is our primary occupation, right? This is at least true for the vast majority until they finish high school, right? Really, from the baby boomers forward, the expectation has been that everybody is going to complete at least high school, right? Doesn't always happen, but that's still an expectation. Graduating from high school is still seen, culturally as one of life's major transitional moments, right? We know this because we mark it with a great big party, right? Grad or prom or whatever you call it. I'm no fun because I'm increasingly sort of cynical about this because, and it's maybe because for me, graduating from high school was just the pathway to 12 more years of school. So, there you go. So super fun. But, increasingly, we treat it as a big transitional moment. And it used to be, if we go back to the silents and the boomers and a lot of Gen X, right, that was their transition from school into the working world. The proportion of them that went on to university was relatively low. But as we move forward in our generational cohorts, right, increasingly being economically successful means having at least some sort of, post-secondary education, whether it is a trade, right, and going to some kind of technical school, or, a 2-year liberal art or 2-year certificate of some kind, although those are increasingly rare, or more likely a 4-year undergraduate degree, and increasingly following that, a 2 years master's degree, right? So I always think it's like, hey, you graduated from high school, yay, now you get to do even more school, So maybe it's that graduation from university that should be the big transitional moment, at least for now. Now, school, obviously, for young people is still, one of our key sites of secondary socialization, right? Outside of the family, you're going to spend more of your time in school than virtually anywhere else. So, very important. It's where those key peer relationships develop. So, education's very important. Okay. So, we talk about, quality of schools. Quality of schools has become, a particularly contested sort of zone for governments, right? So especially high school has become this sort of battlefield that governments fight about. This kind of starts in the 1990s when they start running this test called PISA, right? So the Program of International Student Assessment, or PISA, is run by the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, right? They run this kind of comparative study called PISA every couple of years, and it has been the kind of gold standard in seeing which countries do really well and which countries do really poorly in terms of education. So, if we go back to the beginnings of this, right? And if you ever think that these kinds of things don't actually have real world effects, they definitely do. In the 1990s, Canada and the US were relative laggards in terms of PISA scores. They did far worse than European countries in reading, math, and science. You had countries in Asia that were rising really quickly through the PISA rankings, particularly Hong Kong, South Korea, Singapore, right? So what happens is, PISA has become this thing that now different regions compete on. Okay, on PISA in 2010, Canadian students had gone from mid-20s, right? So in the 90s, they were in the mid-20s in terms of their position in things like PISA. to second in reading, fifth in science, and sixth in math. Largely a result of big changes in curriculums that were done first in Alberta, then kind of copied in Ontario, that changed a bunch of teaching methods, right? So through the 90s and 2000s, Alberta was really dragging the rest of the country up in terms of its overall scores. Alberta's fallen back a little bit now, but again, this has become a focus of the Alberta government to bring these scores back up. The US consistently scores poorly on international student achievement tests, which is, yeah, and I showed you Canada's 2022 rankings. It's the last one I could pull. You know, Canada had fallen a little bit into kind of, not the top 5, but kind of mid top 10s, right? So 8th overall, 8th in math, 8th in reading, and 8th in science, right? Or 9th in math, sorry. So kind of fallen off a little bit. The US is weird, right? So the US is really, really odd. It scores mid-20s in kind of the overall national average. But weirdly, if you took some of the highest performing areas of the US, so particularly like the state of Massachusetts, especially around Boston, Boston would be then that area would be number 1 in the world for PISA scores. And then if you take Mississippi, right, which I won't rate because there's too many S's and P's and I's, in Mississippi would score somewhere in the 30s or 40s, right? So Mississippi scores extremely poorly, as do a lot of states like Alabama and such, right? So southern states that tend to be poor. So the US scores really poorly, but if you take like New York, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, they would be among the top of the world. So some of these scores are a little bit deceptive because the US is a massive, like it'd be like taking the whole EU, right, and comparing it as one geographic entity. Obviously it wouldn't work. So US numbers are a little bit deceptive. Now, one of the really interesting things that's come out in the last little bit is boys are lagging badly in most of these, and especially reading. Boys are way behind in reading, and this seems to be a pretty global phenomenon, right? For example, one of the countries that's generally been held up as the gold standard in tests like PISA is Finland, right? Now, I think this is a little bit dated because I actually don't think if you looked at Finland's actual model and their more recent results, they're nothing special. But Finland's been long held up because for a long time it was like second. Plus, it wasn't like South Korea, which often scores really high too, but where students go to school for like 17 hours a day. In Finland, it was this very laissez-faire attitude, very relaxed educational culture with really high results. Teachers that are very well trained at a master's degree at least. But in Finland, almost all of the high results that Finland has achieved, this is true of South Korea as well, is largely driven by girls, right? Especially in reading. Reading scores, and I'll get into this again as we go forward, but reading scores for girls are way higher for boys. They're really quite far down. I think if you took Finnish boys, if I remember the statistic correctly, if you took Finnish boys and compared them across the board, they score roughly the same as an American student, right? So somewhere in the low 20s to high 30s in terms of their overall reading scores. So increasingly, really high performance on PISA is driven by girls, and even increasingly in math, which has long been a sort of male redoubt, right? That place where boys did better than girls. The difference now is only about 1 or 2 points difference, where boys still outperform girls by about 1 or 2 points, but the gap is closed significantly. Okay, again, more on that later. I have no time. All right, we'll stop there. We'll pick it up here. We'll keep going, and we'll work our way through education. Good times. This is where the course gets truly depressing, by the way.
Do you think those post-secondary increases in cost will see renewal of on that one's more of a pressure?
I think it's going to be more of a pressure to get in, and people will impoverish themselves to do it. And I say that only advance